Okay, so did I add objectives? What's going on here? Refresh the page. There are the objectives. Okay, Tyler, can you read the first objective?
Define and describe module, controller, and scope.
Cool. Mike D, can you read the second objective?
Set values on scope to see them updated in the view.
Guillermo, can you read the third objective?
Define and describe root scope.
And you guys are listening? Cats, can you read the last one?
Explain the relation between dot hierarchy and scope hierarchy.
That one's going to be fun, because like that's really where scope, like you figure out what it really means. Okay, first thing, modules. This is going to be a review. A module is a container for the parts of your app. So a module contains all the things inside of your app. So controllers, services, filters, directives, components, all the things that you're going to be building for your app are inside of a module. And you know this, like you've been putting .component or .controller on the module and adding things to it. Why do we do this? Most applications have a main method that instantiates and wires together the different parts of the application. So a lot of times, if you even think back to like a jQuery app you've built, you might have had like an init function, or even you could think of like the document ready function as, when the document's ready, run all of this code and that is my application. Because Angular apps don't have that, instead you put everything in the module and Angular just handles everything for you. It handles starting up the app and like calling the controllers and adding the components. And by putting everything on the module, that just happens for you. So an example of this, we have, in all of the docs that you guys have seen so far, we haven't actually stored this module in a variable, but that's totally valid to do, but much preferred to actually say module and then .controller without actually storing it in a variable. But same thing applies. So we're creating a module, calling it my app, creating a controller, calling it greeting controller, and then we're injecting $scope. And then on $scope, we're setting a name property to a name. And if we look at how this thing is actually used, so I've got a parent div. It has the ng-app directive. So the ng-app directive doesn't necessarily need to be on the HTML. So like if I want to use this Angular app just on this one little div, this is all I would have to do. Now inside of this div, all child elements have access to any controllers or components that I defined in that module.
I have a question about the $scope.
Yeah.
Because we're not doing that.
Yeah.
Because is that an older Angular?
I wouldn't say older, it's hidden from you in the component. So there's this thing called controller as. I will show you kind of like what's happening under the hood. But essentially it's hidden. Cool.
So since the ng app doesn't have to be up on HTML, does that mean like you could have a normal website and then just have a particular component in it that's an Angular component, and you just include it in that div, and then it does all the Angular stuff just right there?
Yes, you could. I actually haven't seen that as much in practice. Like it seems like if people are doing Angular, they're going all out Angular. But that's totally possible. Like you could have some other app or like even another framework around it. If you just put ng-app on that one little div, it's only going to affect that div.
I just heard people doing that with like React. They
Yeah.
have just a single React component on a normal page, but
And typically, like when people are like transitioning from Angular to React or something like that, that's what they try. Like they convert one page or like one component to be React instead, and then use that in like one place on the page. You potentially could do the same thing with Angular. Guillermo?
So, two-part question. The first one is, you could do that if you want to like deliberately contain the scope of Angular, but otherwise, even if you put it in HTML, Angular is only really affecting the things you call in Angular components for, right? Because you could treat the rest of the page like a regular.
Not necessarily. So what I'm going to show you is root scope. When you add that ng-app, you're creating a root scope. And so even though you're not directly accessing it, you could potentially have an effect on it.
Okay.
So by putting that ng-app on there, you're actually creating a root scope, and then your components create their own scopes, and controllers create scopes, and stuff like that.
So, and then the second question is, I guess, can you or would you or should you ever have more than one module on a page, or would you just have more than one component in the control?
It's definitely, in John Papa's style guide, he actually does have multiple modules. But like a module represents like a page or a feature. So you have your main app module, and then you have a post module that has its components and services and everything for posts. Then you have an about module that has its components and controllers for about. So that's actually a common pattern. You have your main module and then separate modules for each part of your app.
But those are treated like they're different pages, though.
Yes. Yesterday, I think I did a breakout on modular file structure, and I showed I actually created a separate module for the post page, and that same pattern could just be applied for different pages. In John Papa Style Guide, it's called features, so folder by feature. So each feature potentially has its own module. But a feature, of course, like it means an entire page of functionality.
Okay.
Cool.
But you then require those sub-modules, not require, but into the main module, so you have your my app module, and then you have all your sub-modules.
Yeah, definitely. I'll show it real quick.
Sorry, we totally just derailed.
In a way, but it's okay. So, because like we'll start like because I'm talking about modules, it's good to like hash it out. So this is my app.module. All it does is creates a module and then declare a dependency on the Reddit post module. That's all this module does. And then if we go into the post folder, I have post.module. This one just defines that module reddit.post that the other one declared a dependency on. Now inside of here, my component, my controller, all of them are on the Reddit post module instead of the main module. And this allows you to like even compartmentalize your code even more, because when you're putting a component on a module, it becomes available all over a module. But what if you want to have multiple pages that both have a news component, but it's different for each page?
Right.
So if you put them in their own modules, then they won't interfere.
And then how does that nest in your HTML though?
So because in app.module, I am declaring a dependency on Reddit posts, I can use anything inside of there in my app. So the app looks very similar to what you've seen. Like
You
it's
only just bring in Reddit and it just injects everything else from all the other ones.
exactly. So I'm just saying ng app Reddit, and then right there I can still say posts, even though it's defined in a submodule.
Cool. Okay. Thank you.
Alrighty. Yes.
So what if we don't want to do any of this?
You don't have to. Like Angular doesn't care. But you are gonna run into a lot of bugs. Like you're gonna have a hard time. Like by structuring your code in this way, it prevents you from like making bad decisions. Cool. Important things to notice. ng app is where you actually tell it where the app is. This is all review. This right here, a couple people are kind of fuzzy on, but this is the module API. So if you ever see angular.module and you see an array as the second parameter, that means we are creating the module. Like we're creating a brand new module with that name. If you see it without the array, that means we're getting a reference to it, and then we can put things on it. We could put a controller or a component on it. Andy?
What would happen if you like overwrote, like if you did two of the same?
The second one defined would like overwrite the first one, and then like all the stuff added to the first one wouldn't show up, and you'd be wondering like why.
So it just overwrites.
It overwrites it. Angular might be smart enough to give you an error. It's like module was defined twice or something, but it either does that or overwrite it. We could test it, but you definitely will get funky behavior and know something's going wrong. But yeah, that's the main idea. And our basic apps right now don't have any dependencies, but that array is where you would put submodules or UI router or UI bootstrap or Angular moment or any other dependency you would put inside of that array. Alrighty, so that's modules. Let's talk about controllers. An Angular controller is just a JavaScript function. You've seen that by now, and you might have noticed it's like a constructor function. So we're putting everything on VM, but VM is equal to this. So even though we're calling it VM, it's still like saying this dot posts equals an empty array, or this dot add post equals a function. Instead, we're saying VM dot post equals an empty array, or VM dot add post equals a function. But the controller function itself is really, you can think of it like a constructor function. We're putting things on this so they can be accessed in the view. Controllers are defined or added onto a module. So notice right here, ignore this ugly syntax, but basically we're creating the module and then we're attaching the controller to that module. This syntax is a little bit different than what you've seen, where it's just angular.module and then .controller rather than storing it in a variable. But the idea is, this is registering a controller with this name and this constructor function. When you're writing controllers, you add properties and methods to scope. So I will show in a second what this looks like with components. But the idea is all those properties you're adding, they're still on a scope somewhere. Like every controller that gets created and added to the page gets its very own scope that it can have properties on that can be reflected in the view. Controllers shouldn't try to do too much. It should only contain the business logic needed for the view. So this is kind of what I mean when I'm saying like the controller is all about the data, like modifying arrays, modifying properties. It's just the business logic. It's nothing to do with select this element with this ID or put this thing there. It's just modifying the data, and in your view, it will reflect that data. The ng controller directive you probably haven't used because we're using components. It actually does that under the hood for you. And like I was just looking through some old materials and like from when we taught Angular last time, and because you're not using this directive, there's just like a whole class of bugs that you'll never run into. Because when you're using components, it does this thing called create. It creates an isolated scope, meaning no other component, no other thing can mess with the scope that you've defined inside of your component. So you may come across docs that define it like this, but it's essentially attaching this controller to this view without doing it inside of a component. It's just, because in a component you say what the template is, you say what the controller is. Here we're just saying this div is my view and it should use this controller.
So when we're like translating from like older docs or older assignments to like newer stuff, and you see something like this, then basically the way you'd interpret that is you wouldn't have to declare the ng controller because you're already doing it in your template. It's part of the same component.
Mm-hmm.
And then where it says hello name, you would probably do like hello control name.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, let me just do like a really quick example. Oh, that's not JavaScript. So, and kind of like the other way to think about it is this div that has the ng controller on it, you could think of that as a component. So this is like now the greeting component. And we defined that controller elsewhere. And then now any bindings that happen are under $control instead of just bare. So when you see this, you can think of it like this. Cool. Yeah, and that's just it. So because in that greeting controller, we put this name property on scope, now inside of the view, we can bind to that name. So we can bind an input. So when we type in the input, it updates the view. And potentially, if there was a method in the controller that updated name, it would also be reflected in the view. Some notes on ng controller. When a controller is attached to the DOM via the ng controller directive, Angular will instantiate a new controller object using the specified controller's constructor function. So this is actually what is happening when you're creating a component, though. So Angular will say new greetings controller. Like it's actually creating an instance of that controller, and that controller is what is used in the view. This one. Yeah, and for every controller that gets created, a brand new child scope gets created. So every component that's on your page has a different scope, and that gets created for that component's controller. And so we've seen in those older examples, scope is available as an injectable parameter. So when you see the word inject, that just means that it's defined as a parameter on the controller. So this right here is injecting $scope into the controller, but it's very similar when you're doing $HTTP or Angular moment, you're injecting those things into the controller. Here's some notes on controllers. Using them correctly. In general, I've said this many times, but it's important to stress, like the controller should not try to do much. It's all about data and mixing and matching of the data and moving things around. It's not about setting things in the view. Yeah, and we haven't learned services yet, but your controllers will get even smaller and more readable when you start to take out that HTTP code and all of that more complex code, put that code in services, and then your controllers become very nice and clean, and it's just interacting with data. You should use a controller to set the initial state of the scope object. In our case, it's the view model, but that's what you use the controller for. You set those initial values. And then we add behavior. So behavior means adding functions to that scope. Here's what you should not use. So you should never, ever, ever manipulate the DOM in a controller. It's only business logic. So when you're manipulating the DOM, that's known as presentation logic. You're modifying the view. And one of the things, like the themes of Angular when they were creating it, was to make it very testable. So by separating your controller from your view, it's actually a lot easier to test the exact functionality of a function when you're not worried about the specifics of how the view looks or how those two things are interacting. So by avoiding manipulating the DOM and only accessing data, you're making it a lot easier for yourself in the future if you want to test your code. So don't use it to format input. So use Angular form controls instead. I'm not quite sure what that means. Maybe it'll come to me. So Don't use it to filter output. So you've used the built-in filters that can like filter over an array. It's totally possible to like create a function in your controller that does some custom JavaScript logic and like rearranges the array. But that's what filters are for. So don't do that in your controller. Try not to share code, or just don't share code or state across controllers. You'll learn about services, but services are a way of putting data like in one place in your application and then using that in all of your different controllers. But if you try to share a controller across different things, you're going to run into a lot of issues. Your controller is isolated for your specific component, and then if you want to access data from elsewhere, you use something like a service. And also don't manage the lifecycle of other components. So creating services or creating other components inside of your controller, don't do that. Just business logic. What not to do. Cool. So let's talk about the infamous $scope. So $scope is an object used for data binding, and we can define properties and methods on it. So we've seen that. Inside of the controller, we can say scope dot whatever and set that to some value. Exactly like we can do VM dot whatever and set it to some value. But when we put it on the view model, we are also putting it on scope. Scope is just a JavaScript object. It's just a JavaScript object that has properties and functions on it that we have put on it in the controller. And both the controller and the view have access to scope. So this is how data binding works. So because the controller is putting properties on scope, and then the view, it has expressions and bindings to that scope, they both have access, so that way they both stay in sync. And that's why it's typically known as the glue between the controller and the view. I have this line right here, the execution context for expressions. So in your view, when you say ngClick equals $control dot show form equals false. That line right there, $control dot show form equals false, that is an Angular expression. I mean, it's also like a JavaScript expression. But the idea is any expression you have on your page that's including data bindings and handlebars and things like that, the scope is the execution context. So when it's looking for those properties, when it's looking for those things you're accessing inside of that code, it looks at the scope to see if it has those properties. So scope is really behind the scenes of everything you see in the view. And it's arranged in a hierarchical structure, which mimics the DOM structure of an application. I'll go to the docs for this. They have a really cool diagram. And a really interesting thing you can do with CSS classes to actually visualize the scopes on your page. But before we get into that, here's just a basic module, and then an awesome controller that injects scope and sets a title. What this would look like in the component world. So when you create a component, this is actually what's happening. You don't have to inject scope yourself, and you simply say VM equals this, and then you put everything on VM. But this one line right here, $scope dot $control equals VM, that is what's happening when you create a component. It is creating that controller variable, $control variable, and setting an equal to the view model. So that way, when you're inside of the view, quick stretch. When you're inside the view, you have access to $control.title, right? So it's actually just a property on scope called $control. That's your question, and that's kind of what's happening. So the thing is, you don't do this manually. This happens under the scenes with a thing called controller as. But in this case, this is controller as $control. But so scope is hidden from you, but even though you're putting everything on the VM, you're still attaching it to scope, just under this $control property. Questions about that? Yeah.
I'm not sure how to ask this, but say I'm going through code that has scope, and I just want to change it back to VM just to make my life easier. Can we just declare that and then just create things with VM?
Yes, but you would also have to update the view, because in a lot of the examples, you'll notice that all of the bindings are just a property name. It's not $control dot. So you could do this, and then you go to the view and add $control to everything.
Cool.
But that, when you have a view where everything is just a property and not behind some other property, that's where many, many different bugs come from. So by just using components, and by default they give you this nice little controller as thing, that's why you're like not running into those bugs, because it's not possible to like overwrite values, or have values affected from other scopes or different things like that. Chris?
What's achieved then by the separation of like VM on the controller side and then $ control on the actual view? Like they're, like we're saying that they're the same things, that
Yeah.
$ scope, dot $.
Like, why are we calling them something different? Or?
Yeah, like just what's achieved, like is that for like clarity purposes?
It's for like, and it also it comes from John Papa's style guide. But the VM stands for view model, and when we're in the controller, when we're putting things on the view model, that's what we mean. And then the view doesn't necessarily have access to the view model; it has access to the controller. So that's why we put $ control in the view. But it's mainly a style guide thing,
Yeah.
and also like I said, like preventing you from doing a certain bug. Like technically, you could add controller as to your component definitions and call it something else, like
Right.
call it control or call it posts or something like that.
But it's just it's a differentiation between what the two things are. So the controller is the view model,
Mhm.
whereas the view is just talking.
Just talking to the control. Yeah, I realize that's probably not the best definition of it. Maybe there's something better. I'll look into it.
So does the
Aaron?
view model have like other things on it that are hidden from us aside from control that
No, at this point,
differentiates it?
no. But $scope does. So like $scope has a lot of built-in methods where you can say like watch this property, and when this property changes, run this function, or just different things like that. It also has like broadcasts, so you can like broadcast a message across controllers. But when you're only using the VM, it doesn't have any of that extra stuff. It's literally just the this of a constructor function.
Okay, cool.
Sweet. Root scope. Every Angular application has a single root scope. And I should probably say every Angular module has a single root scope. All other scopes descend from root scope. Root scope can also be injected into the controller, just like $scope. So you just specify $root scope as a parameter, and you have access to now modify the root scope. You can think of root scope as essentially, that's your window object in JavaScript. Like if you put anything on root scope, it can be accessed anywhere else. Typically, you don't ever want to put anything on root scope. Only if you're doing like more advanced things like communicating between controllers, and like maybe you're doing some sort of asynchronous action that isn't a part of an Angular library. But for the most part, you really shouldn't ever have to inject root scope into your controller. So what does this mean when we say all other scopes descend from root scope? It actually uses prototypical inheritance. Now we haven't talked about that much, but basically what it says, it's a tree of objects. So if let's say I have this object and I'm looking for a property called title. As the JavaScript engine, I look at that object and says, does it have a title property? No, it doesn't. That object can have a parent, like a parent prototype. If this object doesn't have it, it then looks at the parent. Does the parent have a title property? Oh, yes, it does. Then it actually you actually get that value. But this hierarchy can go many, many steps up. So you have this thing called root scope, where every child scope is prototypically inherited. So if you try to access a property on scope and it doesn't exist, it'll look on root scope, and if it exists there, you'll use that property. Kike.
That's what I was wondering, what's like prototype objects.
It uses, so I have a link to at the very end. It uses JavaScript prototypical inheritance. Like everything, anything you've seen like with prototype or something like that, it's actually doing that, and it's setting the prototype of $scope to be root scope. So this one sentence is probably better than what I just rambled, but whenever Angular cannot find a method or property on the local scope, it will check the parent scope. And if it can't find it there, it'll go all the way up the tree until it finds the root scope. Now, the thing is, when we create components, we are creating an isolated scope. It does not actually inherit from the root scope, which is a good thing. Like we are now isolated inside this component. We don't have to worry about bothering other people or messing with other things. But if you're using just bare controllers, it's totally possible to have like an outer div with an ng controller, and then some sort of inner div with an ng controller, and then this inner controller can actually modify the variables of the outside controller, and that one, the outer controller can modify the variables of the inside controller. But by using components, we're restricting ourselves, so that's not even possible. It's important to point out, though. So let's check out scope hierarchies on the AngularJS docs. I linked to this at the end, but there's a whole developer guide on like talking about what is scope and how to work with it and stuff like that. But this right here is a very interesting demo. So they Angular has this, whenever it creates a scope, it adds this class called ng-scope. So all they've done is said, whenever, like whatever things have the class ng-scope have a red border. So this actually visually shows you the scopes on the page. So we first have hello world. So you'll notice this is ng controller. And so each controller gets its own scope. So this one line right there is just one scope. It has access to the name property. Then below it, this div has another ng controller. So that's the second red box. And everything inside that div has access to whatever is on the list controller. And then you'll also notice that in an ng repeat, each thing has a red box around it. So an ng repeat actually creates a brand new scope for each item inside of that array. So this is visually showing you that on this one page with 2 controllers and an ng repeat, there are actually 1, 2, 3, 4, there are 5 scopes happening on this page. Cool.
So like the individual scope that comes from like ng repeat, is that the only one that does that? That creates an individual scope? Because like that was working on reticle in part 1, like the issue with comments, like repeating through those, like doing it in one, it was showing up on all of them.
Yeah.
Because of how I was finding stuff, but like talking to chat is like, oh, because each one of these is only a scope, they just have to access it differently.
Yeah.
Is ng repeat the only one that creates an individual scope like that?
The other one that I know of is ng-if. So ng-show just adds a display none property, but the element is still on the page. ng-if will literally remove the element from the page, and that actually creates a new scope when the if expression is true. There might be a few other directives that do that, but I know for sure ng-repeat and ng-if create a brand new scope. And that's where you might run into interesting issues where if you have an ng-if on something, but then you're trying to like access an outer property inside of it, and the ng-if isn't true, it's a totally separate scope, so it doesn't have access to that. But yeah, just something to look out for. Like it also creates its own scope.
So is ng-show generally more desirable because you avoid that, or it just depends on the context?
If you think about it, maybe not, because when something is in the DOM, even if it is hidden, the browser still has to load it, right? There still has to be elements here, even if it has class display none. But if you do ng-if, it's not on the page at all, so the browser doesn't have to work as hard. So if you think about it, like you have some really big component or something like that, you might want to put that on an ng-if, so that way it's only on the page if it needs to be. Yeah. But it's on a case-by-case basis, because you might have a case where it might actually be faster to just add the hide and show class rather than waiting for ng-if to add it to the page. Andy?
Then when the if statement is true, does it make any request for that information to be put in?
Well, yeah. So like when that thing gets loaded, it will have access to the outer parent scope and be able to use its properties. But it's like that weird gray area between like when the if is true and when it's not, and then you could run into weird issues like inside that if block. If we look at the source for this, so greet controller is just a controller that, oh wow, it injects scope and root scope. It sets the name on scope equal to world, and notice this, it sets the department property on root scope equal to Angular. If we look in the list controller, it only has a names property. It does not have access to department. But right there, because we put department on the root scope, and the root scope would be like starting at this parent div. And this is kind of what we're talking about when we say DOM hierarchy. So let's say ng-app was on this outer div. That's the topmost root scope. Then this is a child scope that actually inherits from root scope. This is also a child scope that inherits from root scope. Because they both inherit from root scope, this second controller has access to department, even though it didn't define it in its own controller, right? Because you'll notice in list controller, it only has names. But in greet controller, we put that property on root scope, and now it can access it in that other controller. So root scope is just like creating a global variable. If you put it on there, it's accessible anywhere inside of your application. Questions on this? Comments? Yes?
So if they didn't put root scope dot department Angular on, like if they didn't put Angular on root scope in
Yeah.
order for it to print everywhere, would they need it to be in both controllers? Would it declare both controllers?
So that's the interesting thing. If right down here I said $scope.department, it would use that value. But because that value is not there, prototypical inheritance kicks in. It's like, oh, I don't have a department. Does my parent have a department? It does. I'll use that value. So either you could specify root scope inside of here, or you could just put that value on scope in here because that's the only place it's used. Inside this controller, it has access to
Yeah,
department.
so if you just did scope.department as opposed to root scope.department,
It would actually work for the list controller.
but the first controller would not have access to it.
Exactly, because they're at the same level and they're one isn't inside of the other. Cool. That is scopes, inheritance, and all that good stuff. Let me see real quick. Yeah, I believe that's all I have. So I have some links here to the scopes guide, which is on angularjs.org. Also, understanding scopes in the AngularJS wiki, and this is the one that actually talks about prototypical inheritance, and they have like a nice little prototypical inheritance image and like what's happening when you're like trying to look up a property. Does it look at the parent? I think like one last caveat is, and I've already said it, but like because you're using components, you don't actually have to worry about this idea of parent scopes influencing the properties on my inner scope. Your components are isolated, so you don't even have to deal with that. But if you come across code that does it, that's potentially what's happening. Here's a link out to Cora. What is scope in layman's term? And then if you come across NG newsletter, like posts and tutorials, these are really great. I think somebody has NG book in here. The guy that, or it might be a team that does this blog post, they actually wrote that book. But they have awesome articles on like scopes and also on like UI router and stuff like that. So check that out. Guillermo.
So since we're using components now,
Yeah.
and with things like how you can pass in an element as part of an argument function and stuff like that, do you still see like valid situations where you would still want to pass in $scope and use it, or is it something where like moving towards like the Angular 2 world, like still being in Angular like 1.6, is something where it's kind of like looked down upon? There's probably a better way to get to what you're trying to do.
There probably is a better way to get to it. That said, there might be some cases where the only way you could do something is if you inject scope in your controller. I think it was with you, I had thought the only way to get access to a form is to inject scope. Turns out you can actually put the form on $control and still have access to it. But I mentioned earlier, $scope has methods. Well, I didn't mention the methods, but it does have methods. One of them is called watch. Inside of watch, you can actually just put the name of a property, and whenever that property changes, you can do something. So if you want to do that kind of thing where you're just kind of sitting there waiting for something to happen, you would have to inject scope to be able to access the watch method.
What would we search for if we're wanting to see stuff with like VM syntax as opposed to $scope? Because I feel like I never see VM.
Yeah, so, and the thing is, so John Papa Style Guide was like the de facto style guide for like pre-Angular 1.5. Todd Motto has a style guide, and it uses components, and it uses ES6. So he uses like import and export statements and stuff like that. Opinionated AngularJS style guide for teams. Now on GitHub.
Would we search like Angular 1.6 if we were looking for specific docs on like using VM or using components if we wanted to like hone in on it? Because I feel like I only ever see $scope.
Yeah, I mean, I would search components, VM. I would search. Yeah, if you just search Angular component style, because if they're using component style, typically they're now using like VM. But if you look at his style guide, let's even look at a component module. Let's look at components. Yeah, so I guess the other thing is if you see just using this instead of VM, it's the same thing. Yeah, or if they call this something else, you just replace that with VM. Yeah, for whatever reason, he doesn't use because he uses class syntax. So because he's using ES 2015, it's not a constructor function. So you don't necessarily have access to those properties. So in this case, they just put everything on this because in those nested functions like on init and stuff like that, they would have to say like this.vm.new to do. So instead, they just say this. And you can totally do this yourself. Like if you want to start writing class syntax for your controllers, you put your injections in your constructor, any methods you want, you specify them with like the function syntax for a class. And then any properties, you would set them in either on init or in the constructor. Yeah, I'll slack this out too, but the only thing is you probably have to use a build tool if you're writing code like this, because not all browsers support import-export. I don't even know if Chrome does right now, so you'd have to use like Babel to transpile it to ES5. I will say it's rough right now, just because there is like this transitionary stage. Like everybody wants to get ready for components, but then you have all this old material that isn't necessarily getting updated, and people are putting more resources into Angular 2 docs, so it's a tough spot. But Todd Moto has a ton of really great blog posts, even talking about like if you're writing Angular 1.5 in components now, you're gonna have a really easy time upgrading to Angular 2 and like even porting a lot of your code if you're writing it in this style.
What would also be a good resource to go along with that, like understanding like class syntax? Because I don't know that.
Yeah. I mean, it's really not it's not too complex. But I would look up any resources on ES 2015 classes, because it's not doing anything special. It's just literally using that syntax and using the things you know about classes. Yeah.
This might be vacant, but there was an article or like an NG newsletter post on form validation with Angular
Yeah.
in Learn, and I think that was a really great article. One of the last sections was like doing validations when like a field is lost focus, like blur, and like creating like custom directives essentially, and like the code was just like gibberish to me, and I don't know if that's worth talking about now.
Is it this one right here?
Show validation. Well, yeah, essentially that stuff, and then like further down is
Yeah, so
after blur.
one thing
I was
we-
trying to make sense of it.
One thing we also haven't talked about is this directive thing.
Yeah.
When you create a component, you're actually creating a directive with sensible defaults. So like some of those properties are set. This link function, if you're
that was the thing I had to-
if you're ever going to do DOM manipulation in Angular, you would do it in a directive inside of the link function. This thing, for instance, is like it's watching a property. Every time that property changes, it makes an HTTP post request.
Yeah.
And then, because it's like as you
It's
type.
like checking
Yeah.
to see if the username exists in the database and it's unique.
I wouldn't worry about, like right now that's like way
Okay.
way more than you would even need. But yeah, do they have any
It
other?
seemed like interesting. I could like follow generally what was going on, but then like that link, like function, scope, element.
Yeah, you potentially could do this inside of a controller as well. So like inject scope and then just watch the model that your input is bound to. When the input changes, make an HTTP request to see if a username exists or something like that, and then when it comes back, set a property. Another thing to note, if you see older docs that have $HTTP and then say success or error, that's the, well, that was the, I think it's deferred. So very similar to jQuery Ajax, where you can do like .done or .fail. But $HTTP implements a promise interface, so you should always just do .then or .catch. That's scopes. Any lingering questions, thoughts, comments? Go forth in Angular. I think I'll do gulp maybe 11:30 or maybe after lunch.